This journey of fueling your body and even navigating low energy availability is so individualized. And a lot of the times I see so many athletes who are so frustrated because they're trying to follow blanket advice off the internet. If they don't have a period, they're looking at, okay, I just need to eat 2,800 calories and I'll get it back. Or I just need to eat more carbohydrates, or I need to do these 3 things and that will get me my menstrual cycle back. That will help me overcome low energy availability. And that's not the case.
Hello, welcome back. It's Jenna here with Reilly. This is the Eat More Carbs Podcast. Welcome to another episode. Today, we've kind of been teasing that we're going to do this episode for quite a bit of time now. I'm so excited that we're finally doing this episode. We're going to be talking about a very interesting study that has to do with LEA and REDS. So we're going to get into that in a minute. But before we do, Reilly, update me on your week, your first week of 2025. Welcome to the new year. How have things been for you?
I cannot believe it is 2025. I cannot believe it is January. Charlie's first birthday is in a couple of weeks, which is wild. I'm also very impressed that I've been able to keep a child alive for a year. So go Beatty family. As we are looking into kind of 2025, we all are wanting to talk about like goals and I guess like resolutions. And my high kind of has to do with that. When I was pregnant in like 2023, I started to read again. I've always loved reading. That is something that I did a ton as a child. In pregnancy and then throughout 2024, I was able to start reading again. And I read 33 books in 2024 between like Audible and Kindle and Libby and using the internet sometimes to get copies of things. So I'm hoping to continue that trend into 2025. So that's something that, I don't know, I just really have enjoyed in 2024.
Oh, you go girl. She's a reading girly.
I have a lot of time when I was lactating and, walks and different things like that. So it is a combination of a couple of things. And a side note about my reading is I've actually probably read more books than that because of the way I read. I read really fast through my first go because if I'm going to get invested in a book, I need to make sure that it happens like the way that I want it to happen. Like I need to make sure that there's like some sort of a happy ending situation. So I usually will read a book very fast and then I will go back and I will read it again.
She's got to know.
It's very Reilly coded. My low, unfortunately, is, I don't know, a story that rubs me a little bit of the wrong way. And it happened to one of our clients recently. And I just wanted to share because you might have had a similar situation if you are listening to this podcast. It has to do with period recovery. That is something that we do a lot at RBSN. We help, female athletes get their periods back. Unfortunately, we hear a lot of these stories and it's just not really siloed to this one experience. But one of our clients who is working through period recovery right now went to her annual visit at her OBGYN, shared that she was a runner, shared that, she had been working really hard over the last 6 months with a sports dietitian to get her period back because her period went away anytime she started training for a race or any type of like high load activity. She would see her period go away. And this points to low energy availability, which coincidentally we're talking about in today's episode. Unfortunately, the physician would not listen to her. Her physician kept saying like, you have PCOS, you need to go on birth control. And she didn't have any symptoms of PCOS besides an irregular period. I'm not a physician. I'm not going to give medical advice. The physician never even brought up the fact that this could be connected to low energy availability. She was just so quick to give a PCOS diagnosis, even though that there was no elevated labs, there was no cysts on the ovaries. It was just because of this irregular period, and she wanted this athlete to go on birth control, and she was really pushing it. And again, I'm not a physician. I'm not giving medical advice, and we work closely with physicians, but I don't know. It just is disheartening that it's 2024 or 2025 now, and we're still having this conversation.
That rubs me the wrong way too. I know that like the updated care for physicians, they talk a lot more about if you have a female athlete that comes in, that referring to a sports dietitian is the correct method. So I don't really love to hear that, to know that that's still going on. So that's unfortunate that this member of RBSN had to go through that, but I'm glad that this member of RBSN did already have the knowledge going on as far as this is likely connected to low energy availability. And that's why I am working on it with a sports dietitian rather than just going and saying, oh, it must be this, because a physician is a trusted professional. most of the time. So that's tough.
And I didn't even include that the physician wanted her to go on a vegan diet.
Oh, I'm out. I'm all the way out now.
She was like, I'm actually working with a dietitian. Like, I'll ask them about my nutrition. And I was like, yes. If you are listening to this episode, you are a female athlete with a regular menstrual cycle, this is something that you might have encountered, and you should definitely reach out. We can help provide some support and also point you in the direction of maybe the path of care that you need to take. Again, we're not physicians. We cannot provide medical advice, but if you're concerned about a lack of a period, definitely reach out.
I'm glad we're talking a little bit more about low energy availability and all of that today. I will just quickly share my high and low. I know we have a lot to talk about as far as the study results and all of that good stuff that we're going to get into. My high for the week is just that I had a really great run the other day where I was hitting mileage pace that I hadn't seen in a little while. So it's always just exciting to see that kind of number improve or get closer, move closer to a goal that you might have. So being fueled properly, recovering properly, and all of those things have really helped me increase my chance of meeting my goals this year for my running. So that's always just exciting. So a good thing to see. My low is actually just New Year's resolutions, which let me share about this. I think it's wonderful to set goals, to set intentions and things like that. It helps us stay accountable to things. It helps us accomplish things. I love that. But right now I've been seeing so much online about New Year's resolutions that have to do with physical appearance and things like that. And it just you don't need to do it. It's not necessary. It's not something that we need to say on January 1st. We're going to change so many things and I'm going to look different next year or anything like that. So that's what I mean when I say New Year's resolutions. I think it's great to have goals and have New Year's resolutions that are productive and help you become the person that you want to be. But becoming the person that you want to be does not necessarily mean living life in a different body size. So
that has actually been one of the themes of our last couple of episodes, where we are so food positive at RBSN and we're so positive with body image and we're so let's fuel our bodies, let's eat carbs, that sometimes we forget about all of the shenanigans out there when it comes to New Year's resolution and just weight loss and the pressure that we're putting on female athletes, just all of those kind of things in general. It's kind of shocking when you take a step back or when you start to really look at some of the stuff. I'm sure that you see this too from your personal page, but just the things that you get targeted with and stuff like that.
Shenanigans is the best way to describe it. All of those shenanigans that I've been seeing maybe on my personal page, because my food page is really our corner of the internet. And sometimes I am really sheltered and seeing a lot of food forward, very positive, approaches to nutrition, so that I don't always see the other side of things, which is heavily focused on body image. And today we're going to talk a little bit, I think, about performance and stuff like that. So I'm really excited to get into that. We're actually going to skip our training update this week. Reilly and I do have marathons that we're running really, really soon, actually, which is crazy, but we're going to skip training update this week because we want to just make sure we have enough time to talk all about this study. So Reilly, do you want to introduce this study and talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat about this study. This study came out in October-ish of 2024, and it is just kind of pretty interesting to see a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with our clients almost put on paper. So to kind of jump in a little bit, the study that we're going to be talking about today is the Boston Marathon Athlete Performance Outcomes and Inter-Event Medical Encounter Risk Associated with Low Energy Availability Indicators. That is a very long title for the study, but to quickly summarize what kind of the topic that we're going to be talking about is basically this study looked at certain performance indicators and low energy availability among participants in the 2022 Boston Marathon.
Before we get into all of the details of the study, like the methods and the results, we're just going to define a couple things before we start chatting about all of that. I'm actually just going to read it right from the study, just so that way everybody is aware what we're talking about when we say low energy availability and when we say REDS. So relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS, is a syndrome that is associated with problematic low energy availability, or LEA, which is prolonged and or severe mismatch between energy intake and exercise expenditure. The causes of LEA are multifaceted and sometimes can result from eating disorders or disordered eating behavior and or unintentional energy mismatch. LEA exists on a spectrum ranging from adaptable LEA, which is characterized by short-term LEA with mild and reversible effects, to problematic LEA, which may eventually be associated with various REDS features, including negative health, like impaired bone health, reproductive dysfunction, gastrointestinal problems, and performance, which means decreased training responses, decreased endurance performance, and decreased muscle strength effects. So those are just kind of the things that this study is talking about when we say LEA and REDS.
I think it's really important to point out that LEA can happen with or without disordered eating behaviors. And before we jump into the methods and the results, I just want to make that super clear, because a lot of the time athletes can think, oh, well, I don't have an eating disorder, I don't have disordered eating thoughts or behaviors. That means I don't have LEA or have REDS. And LEA can happen with or without an eating disorder. A lot of the time, athletes are unintentionally underfueling because as a society, we have kind of taught them that you don't need to fuel. You don't need to eat carbohydrates. You need to avoid processed foods. And we've kind of, said that 2,000 calories is the standard for consumption. And for a lot of our elite female athletes and just female athletes in general, this number is way too low. So that's just something to remind yourself as you're listening to this podcast, that LEA happens in all different types of athletes.
Exactly. So definitely something to keep in mind. Reilly, can you talk a little bit about the methods that we saw used in this study to kind of collect the data that we were looking at?
So looking at the study, it's a wonderful opportunity to collect data and to look at data and trends for athletes that are competing and training outside of a lab. This study was conducted for the 2022 Boston Marathon. The study included 1,030 runners who were competing and racing in the 2022 Boston Marathon. Data was collected using an email survey, and participants self-reported the data. Within the questionnaire looked at low energy availability, their current training patterns, their medical history, and looked at things like illnesses and injury. De-identified survey data was then linked to wearable time chips and any type of medical encounter that the athletes had while on the course. A variety of different questionnaires were utilized to gather the data. And then, as I mentioned before, the wearable chip tracked the athlete's performance at the start and 5-kilometer increments and at the finish line.
The thing that I found really interesting about this specific survey was that there was a high correlation between if you scored positive on these survey results, that you actually did have LEA. So while we couldn't actually test all of these athletes to see whether or not they did have LEA, those high scores indicate that there is a very high probability that those athletes do in fact have LEA. So that was the first thing from the methods and looking at the survey that was given to all of the athletes that I noted was just a good measurement as far as whether or not this data was valuable.
And if you are interested in the specific questionnaires that were used in the study, we are linking the full study below, so you can check out those questionnaires for yourself.
What about the results from this study?
So looking at these individuals, there was 546 females that were tested and then 484 males that were tested. When we looked at low energy availability, about 42.5% female athletes tested positive for low energy availability, and 17.6% of the male athletes tested positive for low energy availability. When we looked at athletes with low energy availability, those athletes had a significantly higher risk for an intra-event medical encounter. They had significantly decreased performance than those athletes who had a normal energy availability.
So basically the takeaway from this is that if you had a positive survey score, there was a higher likelihood of a major medical event, a higher likelihood of other medical issues or other medical indicators that could potentially impact your training. And then all of those things kind of led to some other setbacks as well. So one of the big things that I saw, and I think you probably noticed this too, was how training was impacted leading into the race. So not only did we see performance indicators during the race, but there were also some things that impacted training before the race, like a higher likelihood of injury and also illness with those who scored positive with LEA.
I think that illness piece is such an important thing to note, because with injuries, a lot of the time we at least associate an injury with underfueling, because we think, okay, you have a stress fracture, okay, weakened bones, we need to look at calcium, we need to look at energy consumption. And obviously an injury can keep you out of training, right? And that's something that they talked about in the study was if you're injured, you're not going to be training the best that you can. But we forget that illness affects training in a similar way.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that those who had LEA or scored positive on the survey, meaning that they likely had LEA, had several missed days of training due to illness, which is going to set you back in overall performance because you're not training to your full capacity.
And that's something that we forget a lot about with like REDS and LEA is that illness component, because we're often just looking for some of those like more physical or direct symptoms of LEA, like a missed period or a stress fracture. We're not looking at some of the other side effects that are happening to the body in a negative way.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to kind of chalk up illness to being like, oh, I have a weak immune system, or I don't have a strong immune system, or even being like, oh, well, it's flu season. Everybody gets sick this time of year. It's colder. Of course, I'm going to get sick. And instead of saying, hey, is there something else going on here? We just kind of like brush it off and be like, everybody gets sick this time of year.
Exactly. Like, why do you have a weakened immune system?
Yeah. I also found it interesting from a medical perspective that there was a correlation between positive scores and values that could potentially cause other medical issues. They specifically talked about this in the male athletes and the significance of potentially having some other lab value markers that could negatively impact health. So that's just another kind of interesting takeaway that I saw from looking at like just the scores in general and like what that potentially means for those athletes.
Yeah, I found it really interesting as well.
What did you find particularly surprising about the results?
First off, I think that it was just really, and I already said this before on this episode, but it's something that we're seeing all the time with our clients. But the idea that if you're not fueling properly, if you have low energy availability, your performance is not going to be as good. And this is something that you and I preach all the time. And if you've listened to this podcast, you know we're talking about this all the time. But it was just really interesting to see it on paper with this specific population, especially with like the running community. There's such an emphasis on like, if you lose weight, go be faster. And it's like, that's not the case. And we say this all the time, but it was just a reminder that you have to be fueled if you want to perform.
That kind of goes into the section where they talked a little bit about the BMI, which I know we've talked a little bit about BMI before, as far as that not being like the best indicator of things that might be going on. But they really highlighted the fact that BMI was not correlated to performance indicators. So it's important to screen all athletes for LEA regardless of their BMI, because there was no correlation between a BMI score that was lower and those who had LEA. So no matter what the BMI was of the athlete, there was LEA present in all groups.
Yes. And even when you specifically look at BMI, with the BMI that was reported, the mean BMI was about 21.1. And then when you even look at the data further, the standard deviation of that BMI number was about 2.7, 2.9, which is going to put you in a normal range on both sides of that BMI. So the athletes that we were looking at, it wasn't even like the data was skewed a certain direction. You almost have like exact bell curve of a normal BMI with this energy and availability.
So this kind of goes back to like your body size or your BMI does not equal speed or performance. The other thing that I found incredibly interesting about this was that the prevalence of LEA was the same when we looked at those who had qualified for Boston off of time qualifications and those who had been entered in the race off of charity. There are different ways to enter the Boston Marathon. You basically have two different ways to enter the Boston Marathon. One is off of time. So you've run a marathon previously and you've met the qualification standards based on time, which are really, really fast regardless of your age group. And then you also have charity, meaning you've entered the race in a different way that is not time-based. Not saying that any of those athletes are not athletes because they haven't met maybe the same time standards. Those are still people who have completed marathons and they've run the Boston Marathon, but we don't see any difference in the prevalence of LEA between those two groups. So it doesn't matter if you are considered an elite runner or a recreational runner, LEA is still prevalent in all of the groups as far as where you fall within that running community, as far as what you're considered from a time standpoint. So that was something that I found extremely interesting.
Also, did you see the average age for the participants that were surveyed?
Yes, it's 46, right?
Yeah, 46. And I think it was 42 for the women.
It did also note that there was a slightly higher prevalence in LEA among younger athletes, I believe, when we looked at all of the data.
And I think too, it's just a good reminder that LEA affects all types of runners, all ages, and even looking at some of the study participants who responded, the majority of the individuals who were looked at were in that like recreational competitive bucket. It wasn't like your elite athletes. There was, I think, 0.9% of the population that was surveyed was considered an elite athlete.
Which we don't know whether or not those elite athletes fell into which bucket of, LEA or not. LEA can impact any runner at any age, and it's something to be aware of because it doesn't mean that just because you're elite or recreational, you do or do not have LEA.
This study really kind of myth-busts the idea that smaller is faster, or being in a smaller body makes you faster, or that idea that eating food is going to make you slower.
I think that there are some really big positives that we can take away from this. The first being that surveys are a very low cost way of identifying something. So we know from this that these surveys, if you test positive, there's a high likelihood that you do have LEA. So if someone was curious as to whether or not they potentially have LEA, this is a very low cost option to maybe find out if there is some type of an energy availability issue going on. And then we can implement things to correct that. So I think that that's a really big positive that we can take from this and potentially implement with athletes in order to identify if there is LEA and correct it if there is.
That is such a good point, because sometimes we just let some of these things slide under the radar, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just shared a big takeaway from this study as a professional. But if you're an athlete who is listening to this episode right now, what are some recommendations, let's say top 3 recommendations that you have for somebody who feels like, hey, maybe I'm trying to qualify for a major, or I'm a high-level athlete and I might have low energy availability? Where should these athletes start?
Without talking to a professional, we don't want to just say that you can diagnose yourself, but if you are noticing that you have frequent injuries, you are having a lot of illness, you're having a lot of setbacks in training, you do have an irregular menstrual cycle, let's talk to a professional. Let's get in front of somebody, whether that be your physician, a dietitian, or something like that, just so that way we can address and make sure that there's nothing else going on. Now would be a great time to meet with a dietitian, a sports dietitian, a running dietitian who can help potentially correct any of those energy deficits that are going on. And then we want to potentially focus on increasing our energy availability, which can be done in a couple of different ways. I know that's not necessarily 3 things to take away, but I would definitely say, let's make sure there's nothing else going on if you are experiencing some signs or symptoms. If you're not experiencing signs or symptoms and you just want to make sure that you are fueling properly as an athlete, whether you're a runner or not, another great thing to do would again be to connect with a dietitian to make sure that you are properly fueling your body just as a person, not even just as an athlete, but just to make sure that you're properly fueled.
Definitely. This journey of fueling your body and even navigating low energy availability is so individualized. And a lot of the times I see so many athletes who are so frustrated because they're trying to follow blanket advice off the internet. If they don't have a period, they're looking at, okay, I just need to eat 2,800 calories and I'll get it back. Or I just need to eat more carbohydrates, or I need to do these 3 things and that will get me my menstrual cycle back. That will help me overcome low energy availability. And that's not the case. We get so many questions every single day about, do I need to stop training? How many calories do I need to eat? And it's so individualized. And if we just provided that blanket advice, we'd be doing you a disservice in your journey, because we don't know if 2,800 calories is enough for you, or we don't know if you can be removed from exercise, or where are we cutting down on activity? We don't know that until we're going through your fueling on an individualized level, looking at your training schedule. And I think that's where a lot of people get so frustrated with, is they're just trying to follow blanket recommendations off of the internet.
100%. I definitely agree with you. It can feel really frustrating when you do follow those advice pieces that you see online and then you don't see any changes from that. So working with a professional, getting in touch with people that can look at all of the areas that we have kind of to look at in order to determine whether or not we have adequate energy availability is super important. We can't just look at one thing and say, let's fix that, and then we're magically okay.
I will say though, if you are working on getting your period back or overcoming low energy availability, and you have been doing something for 3 to 4 months and you're not seeing any success, then that means that something has to change. I talked a lot about this recently on my Instagram, but if you're doing the same thing and expecting different results, you're never going to get anywhere. You're going to stay stuck and you're going to stay frustrated. So you really have to maybe push yourself outside of that box if you are working on getting your period back and you're not seeing any changes or any success with it.
Which can be really hard for sure, is to have to sit down and say, what I'm doing right now isn't working and I need to try something else, because that's not necessarily the result that we wanted from changing something in the first place.
Definitely. And that's probably a hard truth. I don't know if you're listening, if you're ready for that, but that's something that we do at RBSN, is we do like to tell you the the truth about certain things.
You can always reach out to Reilly and I if you have questions about this, questions about LEA, about REDS, about period recovery. That's what we're here for. You can leave them in the comments of this podcast, or if you'd prefer, you can DM us on Instagram. You can find Reilly at easy.sports.nutrition, and you can find me at jenna.fisher.nutrition. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Eat More Carbs podcast. Please make sure you rate, subscribe, and review. And as always, remember to eat more carbs.